afternoon. Here I want to welcome you to the Social Science Forum and the Jack Mullen Lecture put on by the Economics Department. Jack Mullen was an alumnus from UMBC. He received his BA in Economics, and he has very generously provided funds for this seminar series. Today we're very fortunate in that we have Professor Edward Glaser, who's going to speak to us today about economics of cities, in particular our urban future. He is known for revitalizing the field of urban economics. He has written on the growth of cities, segregation, crime, housing markets, and even on obesity for Americans. So without further ado, I welcome Professor Edward Glaser.
Thank you, Lisa. It's am I mic'd in the appropriate fashion? Is it okay? I'm really honored to be here giving the Mullen Lecture. I spent a lot of time in Maryland, and I have no less than 5 in-laws who are graduates of the University of Maryland, and my great-great-great-great-grandfather, in fact, was a MD from the University of Maryland class of 1827, I think. So I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm particularly thrilled to have the opportunity to talk to you about cities and the future. Some of this is going to have the feeling of a traditional economics lecture, and some of it's going to be somewhat more historical and somewhat more storytelling to try and make some points more evocative and clear. I want to start with the central paradox that I'm going to spend the next hour talking about, which is why is it that in an era in which communication and transportation costs have vanished away to nothingness, where we can email across continents, we can Google the resources of the world, why is it that in an era in which it is so cheap to connect to people thousands of miles away, that cities have in many ways, in many cases, become more vital than ever? Why is it 120 years ago, with the rise of the telephone, we were told that in fact changes in transportation costs were going to make, changes in communication technologies were going to make cities obsolete, that no one would bother to put up with the inconveniences and the high costs of living in an urban area if in fact they could call each other. Now certainly that didn't work with the telephone. And 30 years ago, with the rise of fax machines and computers, we were told that again cities were going to become obsolete and everyone was going to telecommute in from somewhere in Montana. That in fact also has not come to pass. And in fact, by many measures, some cities, a large number of cities, have had an astonishingly good 30 years. That in fact, far from seeming like the dinosaurs that they were in the 1970s when I was a kid growing up in New York City, many urban areas feel like they're in fact the most productive, the most dynamic places on Earth. And that urban resurgence, the success of urban areas, is visible in terms of high income levels, enormously high housing prices, and the concentration of economic, social, artistic, cultural innovation, which is now and has always been a hallmark of dense urban areas. The tendency of cities to be successful, important, dynamic areas is, if anything, far more striking in the developing world than it is, in fact, in the developed world. This is the relationship. You'll see a lot of these ugly scatter plots. This is to let those of you who don't believe it know that I actually do work with data, sort of. It's not clear that anyone else is as fond of these as I am, but this is my way of showing you a relationship. For those of you who actually are, research economists in the field, all of these are going to be univariate correlations. I'm not putting up anything that has a t-statistic less than 6 that is also not robust to throw in at least 10 or 15 other things as well. So don't get, this is the relationship between the density of the metropolitan area and median family income across metropolitan areas in the U.S. That dense places are far more economically productive than non-dense areas. Of course, I don't mean to suggest that causality runs entirely from density to productivity. Places that are more productive also attract people and become denser. But there's no avoiding the fact that the most economically productive places in the United States are dense, large metropolitan areas, the places that have the feel of big cities. Bethesda's up there, by the way. Okay. This is, of course, the relationship between urbanization and GDP across countries in the world. Again, no implication of causality is meant, and yet it is a striking fact that urbanization and development are almost one and the same things. that it is almost impossible to find a country that transitions from wealth to poverty that does not simultaneously agglomerate its people in dense urban areas. And that, you know, there really aren't any places up here that are sort of poor and highly urbanized, and there really aren't a lot of places up here that are rich and rural. It just doesn't exist. Now, the central hypothesis that I'm going to try and push over the next hour is that, in fact, the change in transportation and communication costs is, in fact, directly responsible for the rise in the importance of cities. That far from pushing everyone towards telecommuting in from Montana, what the change in communication costs have done is they've actually made cities more important. And that interpretation, of course, suggests that cities are not likely to get less important in the future. They're, in fact, only more likely to rise in importance. The theoretical mechanism, the heart of this idea, is that, in fact, one of the impacts of changing technologies there are plenty of chairs over there, by the way. Just come across the front, too, if you want. That's, we like agglomeration here. More density is better. One of the impacts of changing technologies, of globalization, is that it's increased the returns to being smart. Okay, you see this statistically in the rise in returns to skill that's been a hallmark of the U.S. and other labor markets since the mid-1970s. It's, you know, obviously associated with rising inequality. But the returns to, we also understand this phenomenon, right? That this is about the ability of new ideas to then be exploited on a global stage. The fact that that smart people who are coming up with new ideas in terms of computers or finance or various any type of innovation are able to then, you know, sell their ideas worldwide. And that a decline in the actual cost of making physical goods or shipping physical goods means that the returns to new ideas are higher than ever. If it's become more valuable to be smart, to become knowledgeable, then the question is, how do we become smart? And the hallmark of human beings as a species is that we are an enormously social species. Almost everything we learn, almost everything we know has been taught to us by people around us. After all, you're here in a school, you're here in a college, a university, right, which functions by connecting you with other people that you learn from. Right? There's a reason why we're here instead of sitting at home just reading a book or Googling stuff, although Googling stuff can be very informative. But we learn a huge amount from other people. And to some extent, that is managed through, you know, these quasi-public entities called universities and colleges. But to a large extent, the learning that occurs goes on outside of schools and goes on in the workplace. And that's what cities are fundamentally about. They're agglomerations of smart people who learn from one another. This is what Silicon Valley is. This is what Wall Street is. They're connections of smart people who become smarter because they riff from one another. The urban edge at making people smart through connecting smart people has been something that has been going on in cities for 2,500 years, if not longer, since the days when Plato ran into Socrates on an Athenian street corner and both became smarter as a result. It is still going on today. The difference, of course, is that 600 years ago, when chains of ideas, when smart people learning from each other were able to create artistic revolutions in Renaissance Florence or architectural revolutions in 19th century Chicago, those were sidelines of what the cities did. Today it is not a sideline, today it is the main event. That this is actually what cities are doing that is making them productive. And that in fact the change in technologies, which have been nothing but trouble for the goods producers of Detroit and seem to be continuing trouble for the goods producers of Detroit, will in the long run be nothing but a boon for the ideas producers of Boston and New York and London and Bangalore. Okay, so to get to this, it makes sense to sort of start with the basics, to sort of start thinking about the way that cities have changed over time. And in some sense, the heart of this talk is arguing that cities are as vital, if not more so, than they've ever been, which makes it sensible, which makes it necessary for us to understand what they do. There have always been two basic types of cities. One type of city is fundamentally political. It's based around a king or technically, right, a city is the home of a cathedral, right? So there's a bishop who actually, the political entity who anchors a city. Those actually aren't the cities that I'm particularly interested in. The cities that I want to start you with, the cities that are the ancestors of the American cities, be they Baltimore or Boston, are the commercial cities of medieval Europe, with names like Bruges and Ghent and Florence and Genoa and Venice and Siena, right? They're overwhelmingly cities that are oriented towards either food or clothing. Most of the time, clothing, right? Food and clothing are, of course, two of the great necessities of human life, and they're the two that are portable. right? Housing not being particularly portable most of the time. Throughout most of history, through most of the past 1,000 years, clothing has been more important than food for the rise of urban areas, in part because actually clothing has a higher value per ton. It's easier to ship expensive wool products or silk over thousands of miles than it is to ship food products, with the exception of certain very valuable food products like spices, which are, of course, the heart of the success of cities like Venice and Amsterdam. So cities like Bruges and Florence grew up mostly around the wool trade. They grew up as being centers of moving wool over space. They were places that excelled in the skilled production of wool, where ideas moved from weaver to weaver, from dyer to dyer. And they were centers of human capital accumulation even 800 years ago, when they sort of laid the foundation for really the modern world, which came out of the urban innovations that were produced in these places. They were formed for a basic product, right, for weaving wool and selling it and running the markets that made things work. But of course, they created amazing things at the same time. One set of amazing things that are particularly obvious is the creation of Renaissance art, right? Florence is a wool and banking town, right? It exists for the same reasons that these other cities are. It has a convenient river that runs through it. It has an easy ability to make valuable basic commodities. But there's a chain of ideas of smart people learning from each other, right? And it's a chain of ideas that's very visible, with the ideas of linear perspective that starts with Brunelleschi, that moves to Donatello, who then moves that idea into low-relief sculpture, who brings it to Masaccio, who puts it on the walls of the Brancacci Chapel, which gives us paintings in 3 dimensions, which then opens up a whole world of the ability to create 3-dimensional spaces in 2 dimensions. In Bruges, there's a similar chain associated with a greater ability to work with oils, that starts with the Van Eycks and then moves down to Memling and a whole chain of other artists. Much of religious innovation also occurs there. Don't forget that St. Francis, of course, of Assisi is the son of a wool dealer, right? That these are, although he himself is particularly famous for going out and hanging out with the animals and various low-density activities, it's a pretty clear argument that much of the actual religious ideas that St. Francis came up with were actually associated with living in dense urban areas. I'm particularly struck by this remarkable group of people, the Brethren of the Common Life. In 1524, there's a pretty good argument that 3 most important religious figures in Europe were the Pope, Martin Luther, and Erasmus. All 3 of them had been trained by this one now obscure religious group called the Brethren of the Common Life, which were a product of the wool towns of Flanders that actually believed and thrived through the process of educating people, educating the sons of wool merchants and wool dealers and wool artisans, right, who actually democratized education 600 years ago, again, coming out of the cities of the Low Countries, bringing education and literacy. And then, of course, there's also a fairly good argument that these cities were, in fact, the ultimate producers of democracy and, the very governments that we now live on. There's a statue in the heart of Bruges of a butcher and a wool weaver, Bridel and de Koninck, which is nice because they sort of symbolize food and wool. But of course, the reason they're there is they're 2 urban revolutionaries who were part of the chain of throwing off the various overlords of this wool cities of the Low Countries. They were part of this chain, and they were at least fairly successful. They fought against the French. Eventually, this chain of constant uprisings, where the well-organized weavers were able to cause huge amounts of trouble for their feudal overlords, gave us the Dutch Republic, which of course was the closest ancestor of our own republic. Of course, the urban tendency towards riot and revolt was well shown in Boston, where urban proximity, urban density didn't just help the spread of ideas, it enabled the collaboration of John Hancock, who wanted a revolution, with Sam Adams, who had the ability to actually conjure a crowd in his workings in the ale houses of old Boston. In 1900, go back a century ago, these things were sidelights of cities. The basic structure of the American urban system was that every one of the major cities in America was a node on a great transportation network that excelled in taking the wealth out of the American hinterland and bringing it to the markets of the East Coast and Europe. America in 1830 was an incredible country in terms of the wealth of its land, both in terms of the soil and in terms of the minerals that lay under it. The problem was that moving anything over space was incredibly expensive. In 1816, it was more expensive to move goods 32 miles over land than it was to have them cross the Atlantic by sea. Much of the 19th century was about making the wealth of the American hinterland accessible. It was about putting together a network that actually enabled the products of the American hinterland to move to the east and to move to Europe. That was done originally with canals. It was done with railroads, and cities were the linchpins of that effort. Okay, and in fact, there's a good argument to be made that in fact the real frontiersmen were not the guys on Bonanza who were setting up, wires, but in fact the people in the cities of St. Louis and Chicago and Cincinnati and Minneapolis who were setting up the, rail and water networks that actually enabled goods to be moved from the rich black soil of Iowa east. The paradigmatic industry, of course, of Chicago was the stockyards. The stockyards are just a great example of this, right? Pigs, and to a lesser extent cows, who came later, but pigs originally, were a means of getting the basic product of Iowa soil, the rich corn yields, to the markets east, right? Pigs are corn in porcine form. They're just a very efficient way of moving corn calories over space. They move them to Chicago, they get slaughtered in Chicago, they move east across the Great Lakes, right? Every one of the largest cities in the US in 1900, every one of the 20 largest, from the oldest, New York and Boston, to the newest, Minneapolis, right, were on waterways. Their locations were determined by waterways. And they were basically about this great transportation advantage. An initial role as a center of commerce and trade was then augmented by manufacturing as industrialists like Cyrus McCormick came to cities like Chicago in order to access the markets that then surrounded those cities. New York's three great industries were sugar refining, printing and publishing, and the garment trade. All three of them hinged critically on New York's role as a port. Sugar refining, of course, because New York City was the place of entry for unrefined sugar into the U.S. And you couldn't refine the sugar in the Caribbean where it came from because in a hot hold coming north, the sugar crystals would coalesce. You had to do it, if you were going to exploit returns to scale, you had to do it someplace much closer to the final port of entry. New York, of course, played a major role in the cotton trade, and that was where New York's role as a center of garment production came from. And of course, printing and publishing, the great urban edge, New York's great edge in printing and publishing came because the boats carrying pirated British novels hit New York a few days before they hit Boston. And Harper Brothers' rise to success over Carey and Lee in Philadelphia came because they were able to produce a pirated copy of Sir Walter Scott's Peveril of the Peak a few days earlier, and thereby claim the market. Okay, so in 1900, the fundamental business of American cities was producing goods and moving them around by rail and water. In 1900, rail and waterways had a huge advantage. But this was really killed by the 20th century, right? And that's the next graph. The next line shows the decline in the cost of moving a ton a mile by rail over the 20th century. You're looking at roughly a 90% decline in the real cost of moving goods over space with this single technology, not even taking into account, of course, what was achieved by trucks, by cars, by buses, by air. Whereas in 1820, moving goods over space was enormously difficult, and in 1900, moving goods over space was expensive but possible. By 2000, moving goods over space was incredibly cheap. And the whole urban design that had featured firms clustered up like the stockyards right up against the rail yards in order to save the costs of moving goods over space, that whole urban design became something that was fairly irrelevant. It was no longer necessary to have your urban production right next to any sort of centralized transportation infrastructure. You could decentralize it. You could put it in the suburbs, as Henry Ford did with his great River Rouge plant in the years immediately after the First World War. You could move it to a lower cost state. Heck, you could take it outside of the United States altogether because, after all, it was cheap to move goods over space. And that decline basically challenged the entire urban order. Manufacturing city after manufacturing city fell into major decline over the 20th century as population moved from places that had a production advantage based on a port or a rail yard to places that were simply pleasant to live. What you're looking at here is the most reliable predictor of urban success over the 20th century in the United States, which is January temperature. Right? Warmth has been enormously productive, and some part of that is the decline in transportation costs. Some part of that has also been the fact that we've had public health changes that have stopped southern cities from being killing fields, right, by improvements in, say, clean water. And some part of it is things like air conditioning and other technological changes. But in 1900, our cities were clustered around the great water network of the Great Lakes. Cities like Chicago, which was the linchpin of a watery arc running from New York to New Orleans, all of that stuff became irrelevant. People moved to warm suburban areas where they wanted to live. None of that has necessarily changed. The four fastest growing cities in the country, metropolitan areas in the country over the past 8 years are Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, and Phoenix. Right? All that I'm about to say next does not change that fact and does not change the basic ability of warm, pleasant areas to generate a relatively high quality of life for ordinary Americans. And that's a remarkable thing, and there's much to like in those areas. The remarkable thing, though, is that New York and Boston and other places did manage to come back. And whereas 30 years ago, New York really seemed like it was dead, the garment trade was gone. Over a period of a few years, 400,000 manufacturing jobs had fled the city. It seemed that history itself, not just Gerald Ford, was telling New York to drop dead. Okay? But it didn't happen. And I think the basic story of New York is a chain of ideas very similar to the chain of ideas that gave us Renaissance art. Okay? It's a set of smart people, all of whom knew each other, all of whom learned from each other, where one person's innovation facilitated the next person's innovation. It starts, in fact, not in New York, but in the halls of the University of Chicago, where people figured out how to think better about trade-offs between risk and return. These people have names like Milton Friedman and Jimmy Savage, and then, of course, the names like Sharp and Markowitz, who were students in Chicago in that area, then sort of took off ways to think about risk and return and then applied it more clearly to financial markets. These ideas then moved to Wall Street, embodied in people like Jack Traynor, who went to Merrill Lynch in 1966, or Fisher Black, who came later to Goldman Sachs, who moved the ideas of academic finance to Wall Street. A better ability to trade off risk and return then enabled the young Mike Milken to sell billions and billions of dollars of high-yield debt because he was able to convince his buyers that these securities yielded a sufficient return to cover the risks of having somewhat higher, somewhat riskier securities. Milken's ability to sell riskier assets then enables Henry Kravis to use the ability to sell riskier assets to restructure large swaths of corporate America and to get value out of corporations. It then enables the Lou Ranieri and Salomon Brothers, starting in the 70s, to sell mortgage-backed securities. It didn't work out so well in the long run, perhaps. And indeed, much of the story is about the ability to realize private value, not necessarily claiming that they were huge social value of this, but there's no question that the whole city got incredibly rich and became incredibly concentrated in finance and securities. 40% of the payroll of the island of Manhattan, an amount larger than the GDP of New Hampshire, was in finance and insurance in 2006. 28% was in a very narrow four-digit industry class of securities and commodity contracts. Lou Ranieri, mortgage-backed securities, and then Mike Bloomberg, who moves from the trading floor of Salomon Brothers, which he managed in the 1970s, to his own data production company, providing data tools that were valuable because people wanted the ability to think more seriously about risk and return. A chain of ideas, right? Traynor to Milken, to Kravis, to Ranieri, to Bloomberg, that feels very similar to the chain of ideas that worked, say, in creating modern architecture in 19th century Chicago, where William LaBeranjani and his apprentices, Daniel Burnham and Louis Sullivan, sort of gave us the modernist idiom that produced skyscrapers. Similar idea-intensive industries show up in Boston and other places. How do we see this statistically? We see this statistically in the enormously strong connection between skills and urban success over the last 30 years, okay, particularly in the Northeast and the Midwest. That in fact, if you want to understand why one city is doing well and another city is doing poorly over the past 30 years, you need look no further most of the time, particularly in the Northeast and the Midwest, than the share of the population with college degrees in that city in 1970. That skilled places have done well, unskilled places have done poorly. This is the relationship between income and the initial share of the population with skilled workers. This is population growth in the Northeast and the Midwest. The correlation is certainly not perfect, but that's a 50% R squared, meaning that you can explain 1/2 of the variation in population across these cities. Now, there are places that are slightly off the regression line. York, Pennsylvania is doing remarkably well. Champaign-Urbana is doing remarkably poorly, although given the climate in Champaign-Urbana, maybe that isn't such a surprise. But by and large, if you want to understand why Youngstown is doing worse than Boston, they're pretty much right on the regression line. And that's true for income, and that's true for housing prices, as well as for population. That in fact, skilled places have managed to do remarkably well at reinventing themselves, whereas less skilled places have not. A related fact is the enormously tight correlation between what you earn and the skills of the people around you. So what you're looking at here is the log wage residual in 2000. So this is how much you earn controlling for your skills as a function of how skilled the people are around you. And the type of number is as the share of the population with college degrees in your metropolitan area goes up by about 10%, your wage goes up by about 7%. Okay? Now, there's been a long literature starting with Rausch, and then Enrico Moretti has worked seriously on trying to sort of get underneath this. And there are certainly questions in terms of interpreting these results, but the basic correlations are quite strong and have gotten stronger. That in fact, skilled places have not just gotten richer because there's been a general return to skill, but in fact, there's been an increased return to working around other skilled people over time, which is part of this sort of general interpretation that we acquire human capital by being around smart people, and the returns to that have gone up over time. A related fact is that if you look at the urban wage premium, the premium that's actually paid to workers, it's not that you experience that wage premium when you immediately come to cities. What happens is that people come to cities, and then over time their rate of wage growth is faster than people who stay in non-urban areas, which is, again, compatible with the view that the rate of human capital accumulation is faster in cities, that people are learning more when they're surrounded by smart people. Yet another related fact has been the strong tendency of skilled people to increasingly agglomerate around each other. What you're looking at here is the relationship between the change in the proportion of the population with college degrees in a metropolitan area, the change between 1990 and 2000, and the initial share of the population with college degrees in 1990. This is true, I think, for every one of the past 3 decades. And it's actually, again, quite a strong correlation, that places which started with higher skill concentrations became more skilled over time. One interpretation of that is that whereas 100 years ago Henry Ford innovated in a way that employed lots of unskilled people, in 1985 Bill Gates innovates in ways that employs lots of skilled people. And then increasingly there's a tendency of skilled people to work with one another and to innovate in ways that employs one another. Bill Gates, of course, makes a particularly useful point, which is that we're forced to use percent college graduates or other formal measures of skills because that's what we've got. Obviously, the very heart of urban skills is about making the point that there's more to skills than what goes on in a college degree, but we use this because this is the thing that we have. Gates, of course, himself, not having completed college, doesn't take away at all from the enormous amount of skills that the man has. And if you look at sort of thriving city after thriving city throughout the world, that basically all of these cities are surviving by being in the idea of production business. That in fact cities that were once about goods producing, just as sort of New York was once about the ability to produce cheap manufactured clothing, right, have moved into the idea of production. Once you're about producing clothes cheaply, now you're about producing ideas for fashion, witness Milan, or witness New York for that matter. Minneapolis, right, a hotbed for ideas in lots of different areas, both in agribusiness and in commercial enterprises like Target. And again, sort of skilled, diverse places reinvent themselves. Single industry, low human capital areas do not. So that's sort of, in some sense, the first part of this talk, is sort of making the case about what's going on in urban areas, that cities have been remarkably successful despite the challenges that have been posed by changes in transportation technologies. But at the same time, that causes us to have a need to understand these urban areas better. So now I'm going to make a number of observations. That was bad. Can someone fix this? Okay, I'm going to keep on going, but someone can fix that maybe. Do you think I did something to fix it? Okay, the next slide says what's good about urban poverty. Okay, one of the things that you might have noticed is that, for all the success of New York, it still has astonishing concentrations of poor people, right? And it attracts every year, every decade, it attracts thousands and thousands of poor immigrants. That's true of the most thriving cities in the world, right? That in fact, they are remarkable centers of poverty as well as wealth. On one hand, we are tempted to view this poverty as being an indictment of those cities. I believe that tendency is a huge mistake. Cities are full of poor people not because cities make people poor, but because cities attract poor people. That if you look at the poverty of migrants to cities, it's a higher level than the poverty of longer-term residents in those areas. And then, in fact, cities are attracting poor people year after year because they're actually achieving a higher standard of living, some sort of benefits that aren't available elsewhere. It's being chosen. Some part of that is economic opportunity. Some part of it, my own research, is focused on simply the ability to get around without a car for every adult. That in fact there's an enormous tendency of the US to have a strong correlation between access to public transportation and poverty within the US. And then in fact when you see places install new subway stops, you see poverty rates go up. Okay? That doesn't mean, the critical element here is that's the same, the intuition of this is the same intuition of why urban poverty isn't bad, why in many senses it's good. Okay? Poverty goes up when you throw in new subway stops because those subway stops are delivering value to poorer people who then come to live around the subway stops. Right? It's a sign of actually what's good about subway stops, not a sign of what's bad about subway stops. That you're actually not making poor people poorer, you're delivering a service that's valued by relatively poor people. In fact, in some senses, the problem is not the urban inequality of a county like Manhattan, which is in fact the most unequal county in America. In fact, in many ways, the right way to think about it is the real problem is the artificial equality of counties like Kendall County, Illinois, which is the most equal large county in the US, which is a highly homogeneous suburban county in Illinois. And the real question is, why aren't these places being more accessible, affordable, attractive to a wider range of people, not the problem of cities being that you can't be a great place for both a billionaire and for a new immigrant to live. That's actually something to applaud in urban areas, not to have a problem with. Second observation, why are so many people living in the Rust Belt? Given the things that have come and challenged Detroit and Cleveland and Buffalo over the past century, it is probably as reasonable a question to ask, why does anybody live in these places at all, rather than why are these places declining? Right? In fact, 8 of the 10 largest cities in the US have less population now than they did 50 years ago. 8 of the 10 largest cities as of 1950. The only 2 that have gained population are New York and Los Angeles that were in the top 10. The other 8 have all lost 20% or more of their population. Many of them are actually down around 50% down relative to what they were. We understand this. Right? The changes in transportation technology made the erstwhile transportation advantages of a place like Buffalo, the western terminus of the Erie Canal, made those advantages relatively obsolete. Okay? The reason why people are still there is that infrastructure decays slowly, that there are houses there. And basically, if you have a house, you're going to still have people living in it until the price of that house has basically dropped down to zero. And that's what we've seen over time, is that over and over again, these cities persist, but they persist because they have durable housing. Okay? And if you look at a city like Detroit, more than 90% of the homes in Detroit are priced below the physical costs of building housing. Okay? Which basically says if the housing blew away, no unsubsidized builder would start building de novo. Okay? That housing is durable, it stays there, demand decays, and the homes are still around, and since the homes are still around, the people are still around. Okay? That's basically the right way to think about this. This is just a little exercise. This is meant to show the fact that it's in fact pretty easy to predict what housing prices are going to be with, say, family income in an area. If you use both family income and July temperature, you have a really great ability to predict housing prices across areas. So what we do here is we show on the x-axis the fitted values, and on the y-axis we show the actual housing values for a set of American metropolitan areas. So, San Francisco and San Jose, incredibly expensive areas, both because the wages are really high and because they've got ungodly good climates for this country. Buffalo, Detroit, wages are low. Some might argue the climates are less pleasant than San Jose or San Francisco. Okay, so great. Your model is able to fit the data. We then have another line that goes through here. This is, I think, from 2000, or maybe the average of 1980 to 2000. This is this line is meant to capture construction costs. This is how much we believe it costs to build a new house. And what you're seeing here is that large swaths of America, the median housing price as of 1990 costs significantly less than the price of building de novo. You shouldn't expect those places to grow. The prices aren't nearly high enough that any builder who was not really subsidized would want to do this. Okay? These places, you should just expect to see them continue to decline. Should you be trying to fight that? Should you be trying to bring back declining cities? This comes up all the time. It came up in the case of New Orleans, where in response to a massive national tragedy, our president declared that a great city will rise again on this land. I would argue that the case for artificially subsidizing declining cities is in fact very weak, particularly in the ways that it's often implemented. That in fact these cities have lost their economic raison d'etre. They're doing in general a very poor job of taking care of their poorer citizens. They're by and large not providing particularly good schools or particularly high levels of safety. And it is very strange to think that the job of government is to bribe people to stay in places that are not particularly economically functional and not, in many cases, socially functional as well. I think I'm particularly troubled by the policies that are aiming at subsidizing declining cities, because so often they are aimed not at the people who live in those cities, but fairly artificial investments in place, which have the advantage that public leaders can point to a shiny new piece of infrastructure or a glowing new building, but don't actually reap huge advantages for the cities, for the people who are actually living in those cities. It is very hard to see the advantages created to the children of Detroit or of Buffalo by a light rail system or a people mover, which involves hundreds of millions of dollars of expenditure on various forms of infrastructure, which, to a first-order approximation, no one can see any advantages that the cities had from them, let alone the people actually living in those cities. It is particularly odd to massively subsidize infrastructure spending in declining cities, since, in fact, the hallmark of declining cities is that they have an abundance of infrastructure relative to people. And in fact, subsidizing things like public transportation in declining cities like Buffalo or Erie, or, as a particular act of madness was suggested in New Orleans, putting down some good light rail lines in the wake of Katrina, right? These places have, in fact, quite speedy commutes as it is. You have relatively open streets. There's no clear need for why you'd want rail service on top of, a easy shuttle or bus system. It's clear that these things can benefit developers. It's harder to see how they actually do any good for anyone living there. Another observation. While clusters of genius are more important than ever, they're no longer tied down by productive amenities like rivers and ports. In many ways, the right way to think about government policy, then, towards these areas is to actually focus on consumption, to actually think that your job is to attract smart people and then to more or less get out of their way. One way to think about this phenomenon is the rise of the consumer city, that whereas 100 years ago the right job of government was to figure out how to get the port infrastructure right or to get the rail infrastructure right, in 2008 you want to think about schools and safety and fast commutes and things that can actually make the city more attractive for people who want to live there. That certainly is evident in the rise of warm cities, but it's also been true in the rise of more attractive older cities. This is a little statistical exercise. We created an index of amenities at the metropolitan area level, basically by looking at housing prices and income. And high amenity places were places that seemed very expensive relative to how much people were earning in these places. I submit that at least the 9 high amenity cities, at least they're arguable. You'll notice 9 of those 10 are in California. Honolulu, Hawaii is the one high amenity city of the top 10 that's not in there. These are the 10 lowest amenity cities. I think probably Stanford and Norwalk are mistakes because of mismeasurement of human capital, possibly the other ones. Detroit, Midland, Trenton, Rochester, Minnesota, Anchorage, Alaska. It's all at least arguable that these are relatively low amenity places, at least by some reasonable agglomeration of amenities. This is the relationship between growth and the amenity index over the last 20 years. High amenity places have done remarkably well. Low amenity places have done poorly. You can see the rise of high amenity cities, the rise of the consumer cities, also in the phenomenon of reverse commuting. 30 years ago when I was a kid, if you had told me that it was going to be sensible for people to have jobs out in Westchester County or heck in Montgomery County and live in downtown Washington and commute out, or live in downtown New York and commute out, I would have thought that was madness, right? That in fact, people were by and large, falling over each other to get out of the city to commute in. Today, reverse commuting is a quite normal phenomenon, as people actually want the fun of being in an urban area and put up with the fact that they're actually farther away from their job than they would be. This is, again, the rise of the consumer city. Cities as places of play and fun. The amenity index helps make an additional point that I think is important. Real wages at the city level aren't always good. The core idea, to a certain extent, of urban and spatial economics is the idea of a spatial equilibrium. That people are, induced to be more or less, if there's something good about an area, there's something else bad that's offsetting it. There's no such thing as a free lunch across space. Yeah, it's true that, you know, job market prospects in Detroit are terrible, but that's made up for the fact that housing is incredibly cheap there. Yeah, it's true that New York is insanely expensive, but it's fun and high wages are paid there. Okay? Within this sort of logic, there are generally three things that are involved: high housing prices, or housing prices, incomes, and amenities. Places that have high real incomes, meaning they have really high wages relative to housing prices, the natural economic interpretation of that is there's something wrong with their amenities. And that's basically what you were seeing back there with these things. That places like Detroit and Midland and Trenton were actually paying very high real wages. That's one way to look at this stuff. Now, this is the relationship between real wages and city size across American cities in 1970. Looks good by one measure, right? Those big cities were, you know, paying really high real wages. Well, it's not good. Those high real wages should be thought of as compensation for the fact that there's high amounts of crime and other urban problems that are making those cities distressed. Flip forward 30 years, the relationship is gone. Not because those cities have become less productive, they've become more productive, but in fact housing prices have gone up by more than the incomes have gone up. That's reflecting the fact that whereas in 1976 New York looked like an urban jungle, in 2006 New York feels like a playground of the extraordinarily wealthy, right? And it's reflecting this turnaround, this willingness to pay for these areas. Of course, the decline in real wages, which is really reflecting the incredible rise in the cost of living in urban areas, that's partially reflecting demand for those cities, the robust demand for living in highly productive, highly skilled areas. But it's also reflecting something else, which is the supply of housing. That increasingly our most desirable areas in the US and elsewhere are making it increasingly difficult to build, where we've more or less moved from, to take a gross approximation, from a situation in which basically anyone was allowed to build anywhere in this country, at least for a modest bribe to the irrelevant local officials, to a situation in which basically every neighbor has the ability to turn down every new project. Right? So you moved from a world that was almost surely too permissive to a world that is almost surely too prohibitory in terms of new construction. This is in some sense a revolution in property rights. I want to make it clear that suburbs, not cities, are the epicenter of this. That in fact looking around, and in fact Maryland, because it is county level zoning, is actually not a good place to look for this. You've actually got remarkably sane land use regulations relative to, say, Boston or California, which is really the epicenter. Actually, it starts in Hawaii in the 1960s. But still a large number of cities are making it increasingly hard to build. This is actually an area in which much of this talk, you'll notice I have a deep reverence for the work of Jane Jacobs, who emphasized the role of cities in creating ideas, who argued for the advantages of urban diversity. But Jane Jacobs stood up against development in New York in a big way, and I think she was really wrong. A New York that is shorter is a New York that's less inclusive, a New York that's less dynamic, a New York that's less productive. This is the relationship between density and rise in housing prices. This is the general tendency of big cities to become much more expensive over the last 20 years. One part of this is demand, but one part of this is supply. This is the type of supply thing that you see. This is building. This high thing is permits in Boston. You know, it's quite high during the 1980s. During the 1990s, ever rising prices, but still no building. You can find this in metropolitan area after metropolitan area. Okay, how do you know that supply is going on? Think simple supply and demand graphs. Okay? What you're looking at here is the permits between 2000 and 2005 divided by the stock in 2000. This is the amount of new construction activities that are going on across metropolitan areas. Right? That's the supply of housing. Over here, that's prices. Okay? That's the price. If you thought that everything that was going on that was driving urban housing markets was about demand, what would you expect to see? You expect to see a ray out from the origin. Expensive places would be building a lot, cheap places would not be building a lot. But in fact, you see the opposite. The places that are really expensive in this country don't build a lot, and the places that build a lot aren't really expensive. That is incompatible with a view that the only thing that differs is demand. Because tell me, since when does Las Vegas lack demand? And yet the prices are still quite reasonable. More so today than they were 2 years ago, because of the enormous tendency to supply. And San Francisco, also high demand, but it doesn't have to be. There's the limitations on building have meant that places like San Francisco and San Jose and New York have increasingly become unaffordable to ordinary Americans. And this is sort of the odd thing about the American urban system, is that in some sense the most productive, the most high amenity parts of the country, like coastal California, have made themselves inaccessible to ordinary Americans with draconian land use regulations. The change has been, the result has been that population has increasingly moved to those metropolitan areas that are accessible to new building, that are friendly to new construction. And there's a real tendency on the part of, East Coast urbanites to denigrate sprawl, right? There's something really bad about it. And there are certainly problems. We're going to get to the environmental section of this lecture in 2 minutes. But before we go there, it's important to remember what's good about sprawl. That if you look at the lifestyle of an ordinary American earning, say, $60,000 a year in Houston, and compare say, a family with four earning that with a family with four earning $70,000 in New York City, they look nothing like each other, right? The family in Houston is living in a house that's better than anything I ever lived in my life until 3 years ago. Is experiencing a relatively fast commute, is going to relatively good schools, has got plenty of money left over for buying basic commodities. The family in New York is on hardship store. Right? It's a totally different lifestyle because of the ability, and most of that difference is housing costs. Most of that comes from the fact that unrestricted delivery of new homes keeps prices close to construction costs, somewhere around $150,000, $160,000 for a new home. Right? And it's a relatively decent home, much nicer than the overwhelming mass of humanity has lived in for almost all of humanity's existence. Right? This is fundamentally what's good about sprawl, is that it's offering an unprecedentedly high quality of lifestyle for millions and millions of ordinary Americans. And we shouldn't be surprised that the four fastest growing American metropolitan areas are Atlanta, Houston, Dallas, and Phoenix, because they're delivering that in a way that the cities that allegedly care more about taking care of affordable housing for the poor, that are allegedly more productive, more progressive, are not. Right? That in fact it's just a heck of a lot easier to be middle income in Texas than it is in Massachusetts, because of the ability of unfettered supply of housing to provide affordable housing. Okay. Of course, there are also issues with sprawl, and I don't mean to suggest that the environment is not an important element. I'm going to end with the environmental discussion of this. And I want to talk about sort of two elements in this. There are really sort of two environmental points in this. One point, again, connects to this point about land use restrictions and suburban communities. And the point here is that, in fact, much of the rhetoric of the opponents of development in places like coastal California is environmental, okay, is associated with claiming that, gosh, we've got to stop development because we've got to preserve these green spaces. One of the points that I'm going to make is, in fact, those environmentalists have it exactly wrong. That, in fact, the best thing that you could do for the environment would be to encourage massive amounts of development around San Francisco and Oakland. And the worst thing that you can do is to actually prevent any development in those areas. The second point that I'm going to make is specifically is that cities are, in fact, far greener than actually living around green stuff. And the anecdote I really love is that on a pleasant spring day in the 1840s, Henry David Thoreau and one of his friends went out to have a picnic in the forest outside of Concord. Right? They start making a chowder, a wind blows the fire, they burn up 300 acres of prime Concord woodland. I feel this personally because it's not that far away from my house. Right? But Thoreau does incredible damage to the local environment. Why? Because he's living around it. If you were living in a dense house in downtown Boston, you wouldn't have burned up hundreds of acres of woods. In the same sense today, living in an urban area with a small amount of space where you walk or take the bus or take a train to work, that's a really environmentally sensitive thing to do. Living surrounded by a lot of green space, someplace where you have to drive everywhere, where you live in a large house, that's actually bad environmentalism, at least from the perspective of carbon emissions. And then, in fact, there's nothing greener than blacktop. Okay. This is some economics. What we're actually so for the economists here, what I'm actually going to walk you through is the attempt to figure out what the marginal costs are associated with a new home of an average family. So we're going to hold constant income, hold constant the size of the family, and we're going to ask about the carbon emissions that this household would be associated with if that household lived in a different metropolitan area in the country or lived in the cities or the suburbs. So we're going to count up the amount of carbon emissions that the household does. The number that I feel confident about, or at least moderately confident about, is the pounds of carbon that are involved. To then get to the actual social cost, you've got to then multiply that by a number. Okay? The number we take is $43 per ton. That number is 1/2 of the Stern Report number, which is a fairly randomly chosen number. I don't have any faith in any of those calculations whatsoever in terms of the dollar amounts. So you can multiply it by any number that you choose to do. But I'll stand behind the tons of carbon calculation, not behind the dollars calculation. It's an estimation procedure. It's far from perfect. And the thought experiment is we're going to move a household with fixed income and size from one place to the other. We're adding up 4 different sources of carbon dioxide emissions: private gasoline consumption, public transportation emissions, home electricity, and home heating, which is natural gas and fuel oil. This involves a bunch of different steps to actually get to this. The home electricity and home heating starts with the evidence from the census on how much people spend on energy. We then convert spending on energy to actually energy uses using average cost during this time period. For people who live in multi-unit dwellings, who often have their energy expenditures paid for as part of their rent package or paid for as part of condo fees, we have a method for dealing with that using the residential electric consumption survey, which enables us to actually use provider data to supplement for those people. Public transportation comes from a survey of public transportation, the entire country's public transportation providers. This is only public entities, so say the Las Vegas monorail is not included. We then basically add all this stuff up and just divide by where the public transportation users are. In some sense, our most difficult exercise is getting private gasoline consumption. To do this, we start with a national household transport survey, which asks each individual household how much gasoline they actually buy. So we're not going through a bunch of awkward calculations going from miles to miles per gallon to anything like that. It's actually a survey that actually does strict gasoline. Unfortunately, it's at a sufficiently low level that you actually couldn't form it for each metropolitan area. So what we have to do is we have to form predictions for each census tract based on proximity to the metropolitan area, based on region, proximity to the city center, based on region, and based on density. So we predicted each for the metropolitan area, and then we aggregated up. For all 4 of these things, we then try to calculate what things would look like for a marginal house rather than an average house. So we focus on housing that was built in the last 20 years in these cases. And for this, we also weight not by the average population density in each tract, but by the average production of new housing. Okay, we can skip through all of that, and that's that $43 a ton. Okay, so this is what, these are some basic stylized facts. So what explains which metropolitan areas use a lot of gas per household, use a lot for driving? Well, driving is probably the hardest to explain with basic metropolitan area characteristics, but bigger metropolitan areas use a lot less per household. Okay, so big dense areas use a lot less. The low density sprawling areas use a lot more. Household electricity, that's really well explained by July temperature. Okay, unsurprisingly, this stuff is being used to power air conditioning above all, and it's really the hot, humid places. Now, there are 3 things that are off the map here. The desert cities of Tucson, Las Vegas, and Phoenix actually are awfully hot relative to their electricity usage. One reason for that is that these places cool down at night. And we're looking at residential, not industrial or other manufacturing uses. And that may explain one reason for this. If you wanted to look at the home heating, that's explained by January temperature enormously well. Okay, so what are the most environmentally sensitive places in the country in terms of total? This is one way of measuring the CO2 emissions. They're pretty much all in California. Okay, mostly not because the driving is so good, although it's not terrible. Although California is often thought of sort of as driving central for the U.S., there's a lot less driving per household in California than there is in Oklahoma City, for example, or Houston, at least by our measures. But it's the artificial climate stuff. That California is just this incredibly benign climate. And as a result, it has much lower emissions per capita living in coastal California, which is what tells you that, in fact, it's not as if that would change as you increase the population of California, right? It's still going to be this incredibly benign climate. What are the worst places? Well, they're by and large the places in the Southwest. In the deep South. So Memphis, or whatever you want to call this area, so the middle South, Memphis, Oklahoma City, Nashville, Birmingham, Houston, Dallas, Austin, Indianapolis too. There's a lot of driving in Indianapolis. Minneapolis, St. Paul is sort of the first really cold place that makes it on the top 10 list for having the worst emissions. This is the fact on land use regulations. What you're looking at here is the relationship between the Wharton Regulation Index, which is sort of the benchmark index of how regulated a metropolitan area is, and the environmental costs of a marginal new home. What you notice here is that the most regulated places in the country are these 4 California metropolitan areas, which are also by far the greenest places in the area. Now, what's wrong with this picture? Okay, by and large, this country builds, not during the booms and busts exactly, but we build on average something like 1.6 million new units a year. That's what we need to accommodate the rate of new household formation. Okay? If you don't build in one area, it goes somewhere else. There's an adding up constraint. So in the 50s and 60s, we built an awful lot of housing in California. Gradually, that slowed down, and increasingly new housing was built in places that were much more pro-regulation, the places that are down there, okay, that didn't have a problem with building hundreds of thousands of new units each year. Okay? When California stopped making housing buildable, it moved somewhere else. The net result of this from an environmental point of view is disaster, because you're basically doubling or close to doubling the amount of carbon emissions when you build in the suburbs of Houston as opposed to a suburb near Oakland. And you're, in fact, by stopping new building, it's not as if the environmental activists who are in Berkeley or trying to save the Bay have the ability to control the overall amount of new construction in the U.S. Right? The rate of household formation is burbling around. Those homes are going to be built. All they have the ability to do is decide that it's not being built near them. The problem is it should be built near them, at least from the perspective of carbon emissions and global warming. That's, in fact, the best place for it to be built in terms of so when they seem to put trees ahead of development, what they're actually doing is they're doing exactly the wrong thing. That they're actually moving housing away from places where it's actually quite environmentally sensitive to places where it isn't. City-suburb differentials are also quite significant. These are the cities that have so we calculate the difference in carbon emissions between places that are households within the central city and places on the outskirts. In almost every one of the metropolitan areas of the country, there's fewer carbon emissions in dense urban areas than there are in suburban areas. This has to do with, it's about 50-50 actually, less driving and smaller houses. Both of these things contribute to this stuff. And this is a global picture of Boston calculated for each census tract. I wouldn't actually buy anything particular on these on one census tract versus the other, but it basically paints a picture, which is the areas that are brown are the areas that are environmentally poor to live in, and the areas that are green are the areas that are environmentally sensitive. This is where Thoreau lived, by the way, right there in the middle of the red high emissions district. I think I should end here and take questions, but I think the basic point that I've been trying to make is that cities, in fact, are this incredibly fascinating, vibrant, important thing that has an incredible ability, to nurture new innovations, to nurture new ideas. And in fact, there are many reasons to think that our urban areas are sort of particularly precious and particularly important. It isn't that they need subsidies, but in fact, they do in some sense deserve a level playing field. And let me just end with sort of three very modest policy observations. That in fact, a level playing field means that in fact, the tendency of cities to attract the poor shouldn't be held against cities. That in fact, it shouldn't be that in fact, urban areas end up losing higher income people because we disproportionately ask them to pay for the cost of the poorest Americans. And it's hard to think about a policy that would be, just to take this to extreme, think about sort of the craziness of having busing policies that stopped at city limits, right? That in fact, if you could easily imagine the sense of having an integration policy that went county-wide or statewide. You could easily imagine the sense of moving to a policy where we had vouchers and everyone can sort of choose cities that are for them. Having policies where schooling outcomes like busing stop at the city limits creates a huge incentive for people to actually move right beyond city boundaries. That's an incredible tax to impose on cities, to actually encourage, to create things where actually people are trying to get outside of urban areas to get some particular amenity that they're looking for. The second, clearly I was giving this talk in London last time. The second point is that you don't need the punchline of the environmental talk is not that you particularly need to subsidize cities because of the environmental cost of suburban living, but you do want to charge people for the environmental cost of their actions. You do want something like an appropriately chosen carbon tax so that the people who actually do live in the sprawling high energy use areas of the country actually pay for the environmental cost of their action. And the third cost is that cities really are about change. And it really is a big mistake to try and freeze a city in place. Certainly there are buildings and neighborhoods that should be preserved. But the sort of preservationist, ideology, which is led behind the sort of freezing in place of cities like New York and Boston and London, that have made it them impossible to grow up to do what they were meant to do, is in fact quite costly. So I have no doubt that despite these, non-level playing fields, cities will continue to survive. But these, at least, would be my top three of public policy interventions to make the, cities be more successful in the 21st century. So let me pause for questions now. Yes, sir.
I have a question about things like San Francisco and some other cities where the housing prices were maybe artificially kept high. Do you think that is because like a city like DC, Baltimore, there seems to be a cycle where the residential value was high at one point, then went low, now it's high again. Is there a correlation between the housing prices and maybe the crime rate or something else?
Well, crime rates certainly are known to be significant predictors of low property values. You know, Baltimore still looks a little bit more like Baltimore is in sort of this funny position of sort of, you know, 15 years ago you would have thought of it sort of primarily as fitting in the declining city mold, as being, you know, around here, somewhere sort of down in this group. It's, you know, it's still there. This is Baltimore. It's right here. So it's doing all right, but it's not, you know, you know, it still is a former port that, you know, has had trouble making the transition. And, you know, I think that's, I'm bullish on Baltimore in the longer run, but there certainly are many things that shared in common with lots of, you know, declining cities. Now the good news in some sense is that Baltimore is part of this East Coast corridor that is really the hub of, you know, the urban, you know, urban America. So because it's part of that, I think it's experienced a certain amount of regeneration through that. I guess I'm less, I mean, I sort of, you know, a lot of Baltimore's regeneration is often linked to the large infrastructure projects in the harbor, which, you know, I enjoy the harbor as much as the next person. I actually don't think this is, you know, where Baltimore's, you know, long run future comes from at all. Though some of the investing in amenities is an attractive thing as well. Yes, sir.
If you're a recent college graduate, which city would you pick to live?
I have no idea what in the world you like in a city. How could I possibly, you know, we know what incomes look like in different areas. You know what amenities look like. You need to figure out your willingness to trade off, you know, low housing prices with high wages with, you know, California sunshine, and figure out what your, you know, what your tastes are. You know, in some sense, the principle of the spatial equilibrium that undergirds all this analysis, there is no such thing as a free lunch. You're not going to get a place that's, you know, cheaper, has higher wages, and has better amenities thrown into it. You're going to be making trade-offs, so you've got to figure out the right way to make the trade-offs for you. Okay. Yes, sir.
Well, I was thinking of, you could think of like schools as being places or intellectual communities, and so that then was thinking of one study in which then there have been students who were admitted to both private institutions with like really smart students on average, and then less prestigious institutions, right? But then some went to each downstream, that there wasn't very much difference in their earnings, which in these peer effects had been real important. That then you'd expect that would be higher. Also, that apparently the gap between private university academic salaries and public academic university salaries has widened. One explanation that was given for that was because of the internet and whatnot, that then it was the case that the folks could exchange ideas without being co-present, and so the private still wanted to attract the very best, right? Then they had to raise their salaries relative to the publics, and so those were two examples that were saying, well, within these sort of advances in information technology, you know, may not be in the whole story.
Right. So I think they're two separate examples here, and let me take them separately. The second one is the Luigi Zingales paper on peer effects in particularly, actually, I think it's just economics departments. The fact that there isn't a huge difference between these highly selective schools and often state schools, I don't think I see as being dispositive on this at all, right? I mean, state schools, in fact, are large agglomerations, actually allow for large amount of sorting by skill, and there's lots of it. There's no sense in which, you know, you could really interpret the evidence as suggesting that the people who go to state schools aren't finding lots of smart people for them to interact with. You know, that they may find people who don't value the amenities of certain of the, you know, more expensive private schools, but it doesn't, you know, at least everyone I knew who went to the University of Maryland, just to choose an example, certainly hung out with lots of smart people and learned plenty from them. So that one I don't see as being particularly troubling for the, you know, the human capital spillovers view of the world. There is this specific example of the Zingales evidence on the decline of its phrase is our top economics departments losing their edges, right? That's his, and it's done with individual fixed effects and sort of showing the treatment effect from being around in one of the top departments. I think there are, I think it's basically an interesting paper. I think there is a question about how much we, buy its generalizability to other settings. It's also true that sort of the urban edge tells you that, you don't need to be at MIT if you're in Boston. You can be at BU and you're still getting the sort of, urban advantages of that agglomeration. So it's not, my own view would be that many of these gains are not just within the firm as well. I think we do also have lots of within-firm evidence, such as the, recent Moretti paper on, who you get paired with within the firm that sort of also tends to, we have lots of evidence going in the opposite direction that supports the view that actually working around smart people makes you more productive in lots of areas. But both of them are serious questions, but it's, thank you. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Based on your research, what do you think the future will be in the development of new cities?
Where?
Anyway.
Well,
given that transportation and communication costs are of less importance, does that seem to indicate that the physical location of the city, setting aside issues of climate, is less important?
For sure. That's been a sort of running theme of this, that in fact, you no longer need to be, think about how unique the geographies are of the oldest American cities, right, relative to any other place next to them. Think about how special, the downtown tip of Manhattan is, or, Chicago, where the Chicago River, which connects to the Illinois-Michigan Canal, runs into Lake Michigan. These are special places, right? In some sense, the right way to view at least the way that I view the world is, in fact, I'm a big geographic determinist when it comes to, 19th century America. And in fact, that these places really did have a huge built-in geographic advantage. Today, Las Vegas is Las Vegas. It could be 50 miles to the west, 50 miles to the east. Yeah, there's some association with the Boulder Dam, but gosh, it's more or less indifferent. So yeah, I think basically, we went from a world with a very large degree of geographic determinism to a world in which we had much less so, and where there's much less of a constraint, a geographic constraint on where cities can locate. Any other? Yes, sir.
You might have already talked about this, but I wasn't in the beginning. What do you think, or what are the main driving factors behind economic developments in urban
areas? The overarching theme of the talk was that urban areas are growing because they're centers for new idea production. They're agglomerations of smart people who learn from one another and become more productive because they hang around each other. And we see this in the rise of idea-intensive industries such as finance in New York, or computers in Silicon Valley, or fashion in Milan. And that's basically the right strategy for urban economic success is to try and attract smart people and get out of their way. Yes, sir.
On that subject of higher concentration of human capital leading to greater intellectual productivity. Do you think that the rising popularity and production of devices such as iPhones or BlackBerries that tend to compartmentalize people will reduce the sporadic encounters of different intellectuals?
Yeah, it's a neat question. One way to think about electronic interactions is the question about whether or not electronic interactions and physical interactions are substitutes or complements, right? Using the economic language. I think 15 years ago 12 years ago when I first wrote on this, I argued that in fact the whole world was acting as if it was obvious that they were substitutes. That in fact we would go from having face-to-face contact would no longer be necessary because we had these different ways of connecting. And I argued that there was at least as much evidence suggesting that they were complements rather than substitutes. And you see this in terms of the telephone usage data, that people who actually use telephones to call each other, also people who meet face to face. You see this in terms of the across space, the places that use lots of two-way communications technologies are also higher density, more urbanized areas, both across countries and within countries. You see this in the very fact that the industry, that is the most technologically sophisticated industry, that has the best access to various forms of interactive technologies, has become the very model of a geographically concentrated industry famous for its face-to-face interactions. And I'm talking, of course, about Silicon Valley, right, which is famous for both its use of technologies and its geographic clustering. So I don't think any of those things are conclusive, but I think they certainly suggest that there's at least as much complementarity between electronics and face-to-face stuff. Now, it's not true for every electronic technology, right? Satellite dishes are really good in low-density places. Particularly the one-way technologies tend to be very heavily used in lower-density areas. It's the two-way technologies that tend to be more urban, for example. So both of these things go on. I mean, another way to sort of see the 20th century, actually, in terms of these urban interactive technologies, is if you go back 100 years ago, there was a huge, interactive difference between living in rural Iowa and living in Chicago. I mean, you read something like Dreiser's Sister Carrie, and you think about the young woman as she's on the train going from Iowa to urban life. The economic change that she experiences is quite modest relative to the social change that she experiences. This sort of incredible urban world, which of course, she gets into a lot of trouble, at least by some measures, from doing so. But it certainly sounds like a lot more fun than the life she left behind. Much of the 20th century evened the playing field between cities and urban areas. That we had a whole bunch of new technologies that made it, much more pleasant to live in low density areas, right? We had movies, we had radio, we had lots of things that you could do outside of urban areas. The interesting thing is, over the last 30 years, we've had a bunch of changes, both technological and economic, that seem to have actually tilted things a little bit the other way. Both because some of these electronic technologies seem to be very good for facilitating face-to-face contacts, but also because rising income inequality and rising education levels have actually increased demand for the particularly urban amenities. So this is sort of part of the economic story that lies behind the rise of the consumer city, is the fact that cities have these edges that come from the ability to pay for fixed costs, say in providing museums or opera houses or what have you, but also come from the fact that dense urban markets are more innovative and competitive in the world of consumer amenities, just as they are in the world of finance or in the world of killing hogs in Chicago, right? I mean, nothing's more dynamic than the restaurant business in New York or London, right? People are copying each other, learning from each other, innovating, and this is part of what makes New York exciting and fun to live in, as well as economically productive. And I think those are edges which have become more important as people have become richer and more willing to trade off, other inconveniences for that amount of fun. So I think I'm going to end on that, given Lisa's getting up, or should I ask more questions?
Sure, I think that's it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all very, very much for coming, and thank you for